For us, it all started in 2013. We had received a grant to continue working with activist partners, with women's rights activists in the Middle East region. At that time, we had a very long track record of doing our activist work and working with partners all over the world. And we were experiencing sometimes delays with the bank account that we had, so we thought maybe it's a good idea to just have a second bank account so we can make sure the money always ends up timely, whenever we transfer that to our partners. When our treasurer went to open a second bank account, and he went to a very well-known Dutch bank, they started asking him, why are you opening this bank account? What kind of work do you do? Who do you work with? So he explained it's for the project in the Middle East region. We're going to work with activists there. And they started asking, will this include Syrian activists? And he said, yes, it's very likely. And that was enough to basically make them decide that they were not going to give us a bank account. And I remember that he told me that, and I was completely shocked. It's like, we are living in a democratic country. We have a completely clean track record. We're definitely not on any list. How can a bank refuse us a bank account? And it's also the irony that the grant we got was from our own Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So on the one hand, you have government funding, which shows that your own government trusts you to handle funding responsibly. And then on the other hand, you have a commercial actor who, because of the financing rules, is scared to basically provide you with access to a bank account. And then we knew something was going definitely wrong.
Good morning. At 12:01 this morning, a major thrust of our war on terrorism began with the stroke of a pen. Today, we have launched a strike on the financial foundation of the global terror network. I've signed an executive order that immediately freezes United States financial assets of and prohibits United States transactions with 27 different entities. They include terrorist organizations, individual terrorist leaders, a corporation that serves as a front for terrorism, and several nonprofit organizations.
U.S. President George Bush said that money is the lifeblood of terrorism. It was a theory that has since been discounted, but because the 9/11 attacks did cost some money, and I don't think maybe they didn't have much idea of what else to do, so they went after the money.
We don't really have the evidence that suggests, well, this is all worthwhile because, look how successful we're being in the fight against terrorism and the war on terrorist financing. On the contrary, if we look around the world, things are going in one direction, it's worse, not better.
يعني قوانين الإرهاب ما وقفتش الإرهاب. وقفت الناس اللي هي الحقيقية تدافع ضد الإرهاب، وإن هي ضد كل الإرهاب، كل أشكال الإرهاب.
So it really dates back to the late 80s when the G7 group of states convened this, what was called the Financial Action Task Force. The rationale was that drug cartels and organised criminals were able to move their money, launder money without hindrance. There was no global framework obliging states to cooperate in investigating and preventing money laundering. So the Financial Action Task Force reports back in sort of 1990, 40 recommendations, and that really set set the background for the international conventions we have on money laundering and all the national regulations we have since. In the late 90s, the US was pushing for this framework to be extended into other areas, counter-terrorism. So obviously you've set up this huge sort of international enforcement regime, and the US and other states wanted to extend it, but this was sort of rebuffed at the time. Then 9/11 happens.
Oh, shit!
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there.
Oh,
that is the World Trade Center.
There was another one.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
So very much in the aftermath of the events of September 11 in 2001, the international community brought a whole new focus to countering the financing of terrorism. A core feature of this shifting landscape to address terrorism financing was that stakeholders that had traditionally not been the core actors in national security policy suddenly had a very influential role.
And very quickly we have a whole bunch of Security Council resolutions, the US adopts the Patriot Act, and this idea of using the FATF framework to also address terrorist financing is suddenly back on the agenda, and within sort of 6 weeks of 9/11, FATF has adopted a sort of fairly comprehensive counter-terrorist financing framework.
The way they operate is that they have their recommendations on what laws should do, and they go around and evaluate almost every country in the world on how well they meet those standards, and then they publish the ratings. So if a country comes up short, that country may have trouble getting foreign investment, their international bond rating may go down, there are some severe economic consequences. So that even though FATF isn't something that exists because of treaty agreements, it has no legal authority at all, but because of the effect it can have on countries' economy, it actually is very powerful and has a lot of influence.
What that framework does is places different obligations on different groups, but it obliges states to ensure that they have adequate rules in place to prevent terrorist financing. It also puts non-profit organisations in the frame, so it specifically suggests non-profits are vulnerable to abuse by terrorist organisations, so it obliges states to ensure they have mechanisms in place to address that. And then it places a whole bunch of obligations on private actors, so the banks, who are also obliged to check that their customers, the transactions that they process, are not involved in terrorism, or that the money's not going to end up in the hands of terrorists.
We're working closely with the United Nations, the EU, and through the G7, G8 structure to limit the ability of terrorist organizations to take advantage of the international financial systems. We will lead by example. We will work with the world against terrorism. One dime of money into a terrorist activity is one dime too much.
In the global world of counterterrorism, in the last 15 years, you've seen a lot of lists coming up and people on lists being identified as terrorist or sometimes terrorist organization. The list can be national, it can be regional list, can be UN lists. It can be lists from other countries that are imposed on other countries. So if you work with organization and you transfer money, you always have to check the transfers and the money through or against these lists. So you have to be sure that you don't transfer money into the hands of people that are on terrorist lists. The first problem here is that most of the lists are in a way very political, so it's not always a very objective kind of list. Sometimes you have seen inflations of lists. Many people were added without a due process, so there's a problem here. And the second problem is that we don't even talk about the real list of terrorists, because that's relatively easy.
So with a zero tolerance approach that made it very difficult for organizations trying to operate in global hotspots to do so without fear of getting shut down by U.S. Treasury, having their funds frozen, or having other penalties. So, then it wasn't just the U.S., because this went to the UN. and end up with UN sanctions program, UN terrorist lists. The system became global.
The implementation of these counterterrorism financing legal and regulatory frameworks has really generated a series of quite concrete policy incoherences. One incoherence, for example, is that in many parts of the international community we have an emphasis on the importance of women's rights defenders, women's contributions to peace building, and more broadly gender mainstreaming in addressing conflict and post-conflict situations. But on the other hand, these rules are cutting off funding and limiting the financial services for those very groups.
Why is this important? Why should we care about activist organizations or women's rights organizations being hit by this? Now, first of all, because not only international policy, including national policies, so policies our countries have signed on to, but as well as research really shows out that women are playing a crucial role in building peace in their countries. From being active on a local level, bringing warring parties together or making their communities more resilient, to even the national level and playing a key role in making sure that peace agreements are sustainable. So you can only imagine that if women's peace power, and we're talking here about 50% of the global population, is not being used to its full potential, this is undermining peaceful societies and societies where everyone's human rights are going to be respected on a global scale. So we really cannot afford losing these forces of resilience, what I would always say the immune system of our societies that are in every corner of the world, whether it's in south or east, north or west. So that is why we really need to address how this issue is affecting every form of civil society organizing. Without a strong and diverse civil society, we will not have democracy.
In that context, and to respond to some of the realities that women's groups are experiencing on the ground, WPP and the International Human Rights Clinic at Duke University School of Law addressed a research project to really identifying the ways in which the implementation of countering terrorism financing rules impacted on women's organizations, women's rights organizing, and gender equality. And the findings of that research were incredibly stark. The overarching finding was these rules, both directly and indirectly, have cut off financial services to women's organizations, and they have directly impacted on the amount of operating space and resources available to these groups. To give an example of the starkness of that effect, in the survey that WPP conducted for the report, we had 86.67% of respondents identified that their organization's work, for example in rule of law, in promotion of gender equality, in conflict resolution, had an upstream effect in contributing to combating forms of terrorism, violent extremism in their communities. At the same time that 86.67%, large majority of respondents, indicated their work had this upstream effect to counter terrorism and violent extremism, 90% identified that counter-terrorism had an adverse impact on the ability of their organization to do their daily work.
About 58% of the people we interviewed said that the restrictions are coming from governments who are using counterterrorism financing to come up with all kinds of regulations for civil society which they experience as restrictive. On the one hand, governments are under pressure to follow the FATF rules and incorporate counterterrorism financing in their regulations and NGO legislation. On the other, we've also seen that some governments are using that to crack down on very critical voices in civil society. And very often those are women's groups. Women's groups challenge power interests. They fight for gender equality. So many times those are issues of power, issues of controversy, issues that are very political. So that makes them also a target of these regulations.
because we work with grassroots women NGOs, and there are 4 community-based who are helping us with the project, and we should pass the money from our account to their accounts. And the bank started to say, we need from these small NGOs, community NGOs, this and that and this and that, you know. When we gave them everything, they delayed the money. And then they said, get us their approval, the NGOs, we got it. Now we will have to ask the approval of the ministry. We have told the ministry before. You know, it is in the project, and the project is with them. You know, these complications are created, you know, a day after day. So the restrictions are not at one attack. They are building up the restrictions and the complications. And maybe at the end of the day, so many NGOs would say, why should we care for that? We're voluntary NGOs, and we're helping the government for the life or the livelihoods of communities. Why should they do all these restrictions? We're helping them in a way or another. Of course, our cause is to speak about the women's rights because we believe in that. But if we're helping other NGOs, it is helping the livelihood in the communities which are neglected by the government. They should thank us for that, but they create restrictions.
But the reality is that the government needs to, at least at the national level and the regional level, the government needs to rethink their approach to civil society. My understanding is that government hardly consider civil society organization as their serious partner. They always found them as something like, you know, their opponents, though it has not been declared. But you can sense that from the degree of surveillance, and sometimes their concerns on issues and organizations who are committed to continue their activism on issues around human rights or women's rights. I think that space and that processes which has been evolved and created, that should not be degenerated. If that is degenerated, it's not just the loss that civil society will face. I think the entire country and the society at large will be affected by this loss.
One thing that has developed is that the banks now are expected to be gatekeepers to the financial system and to report suspicious activities, and they have also been subject to some very aggressive enforcement and have become very shy about providing services to nonprofits that work in all parts of the globe.
What all this has meant in practice is that banks have become very suspicious about non-profit organizations, and part of the reason is because they've been told that non-profits pose a particular risk, but it's also because banks don't really understand the way non-profits work. They don't understand what they do. They're not able to sort of model and profile the kind of activities that non-profit organizations do in the way that they are able to profile other businesses. So they're looking at where these organizations work, so if they have a close proximity to conflict zones or areas that are associated with terrorism, the banks are looking at this and saying, well, how can we be sure that, you know, we don't facilitate the transaction that ends up in the hands of the person who passes the money to a terrorist organization? And as a result of that, they're just saying in increasing numbers to non-profits, either we don't want your business, or the level of compliance that you have to do is going to be so extensive that either certain non-profits can't fulfill those obligations, or the larger organizations that have to expend an inordinate amount of resources just to comply with these regulations. But in a lot of cases, what we've seen happening is the banks are just saying, we're not going to touch this at all.
But if you go back to the let's say, the business behavior of banks, and banks is business, if it's too expensive to take you as a client, and if the risk, the liability or the legal risk or the financial risk are too high when something goes wrong, of course the reaction is to pull out, and that's what you see happening.
The biggest problem was delays in transfers, and we heard many stories about how that impacted programs. There was a hospital in Syria that ran out of fuel for their generators because they couldn't pay the fuel bill, and they lost their electricity, and some people died in the hospital because they didn't have the equipment running they needed to run. There was a program in Afghanistan that was meant to help people get through the winter, blankets, fuel for heat, things like that. The delay in the transfer took so long that winter was over by the time the money went through. There seems to be a basic attitude that collateral damage is acceptable or more acceptable in Muslim populations, rather than seeing civilian populations who are stuck living under the control of a terrorist group like Al-Shabaab. They're treated like supporters of Al-Shabaab. That caused over 250,000 people to die in 2011 in the famine in Somalia, and the UN study cited legal restrictions on aid groups as a factor in that high death rate. So you have a lot of problems along those lines.
ويكون فما يعني إجراءات بنكية صعيبة أو مانعة لحصولنا على المنح في إطار مقاومة الإرهاب، أو في إطار الخطة لمقاومة الإرهاب أو برنامج مقاومة الإرهاب في تونس. بالنسبة لفتح حساب هو شيء ما هو شيء صعيب في تونس الحقيقة، يعني مش صعيب إنه جمعية تفتح حساب، لكن الصعيب من بعد التثبت. احنا ما زلنا في فترة التثبت. احنا ماناش ضد انه الدولة تتثبت من مصادر التمويل، لكن تكون الاجراءات واضحة، وتكون التواريخ يعني مدة التثبت ما تكونش معيقة لتنفيذ البرامج اللي متعاقدين من أجلها مع الجهات المانحة، لأنه يفقدنا المصداقية متاعنا مع الجهات المانحة ومع الشركاء ومع المشاركين في الأنشطة اللي ننظموهم وفي المشاورات ومختلف الأنشطة ومختلف الحراك المدني.
The way this impacts non-profits takes lots of different forms. So in some senses it just means, transactions are delayed, or they have to provide more documentation or show what's going on. But in very extreme cases it just means that, banks are just cut off these clients altogether. You literally get a letter in the post saying you've got 2 months to you no longer fall within our risk appetite, you've got 2 months to find another financial services provider. This has a knock-on effect, because when you go to try to find another service provider, the bank says, well, what's happened to your other account? And they say, well, your other, why are you changing accounts? And if you say, well, the last bank thought we were a bit risky, you're very unlikely to get another bank account. If you look at the extent of this in the UK, we know of at least 300 charities that have had their accounts closed down, and they have then had ongoing problems trying to find further financial services. But this is just the reported instances. There's no official mechanism to actually, record how extensively this is happening. Another important thing to note is that this kind of thing tends to disproportionately impact the smaller organisations, because the bigger ones, ultimately they can the Oxfams of this world can negotiate this terrain, because they take on more staff, they have compliance officers, they take on accountants, lawyers, they have relationships with the banks. Smaller organisations simply, cannot satisfy the things that are asked of them.
We could certainly lose very important diversity within the sector if banks, for example, will only serve large organizations or organizations that get government money, for example.
There's no real incentive at the moment for the banks to take a different approach, and all of this is underscored by the fact that failures in this due diligence have been penalised by extremely heavy penalties. So, and some of these are well deserved. We had banks presiding over huge money laundering operations that rightly resulted in fines of, billions of dollars. But we've also seen banks also penalised in much smaller ways, but just for sort of everyday lapses in due diligence. They're very, very heavily regulated. So all of this, the rising cost of compliance and the increased risk aversion is really just squeezing financial access for non-profits of every stripe.
البنوك ماهيش من حقها انها تشتغل يعني حجرة ثانية للأعمال التجسسية سواء من داخل البلاد أو من خارج البلاد. البنوك معناها يلزمها تسهل وتوضح العمليات يعني الأموال كيفاش تجي وكيفاش تمشي. ما يلزمهاش تدخل إذا طلبوا منك أنك أنت تتحقق من عمل جمعيات فاتصل بالجمعية وعطاها انشر، يعني كن واضح. ما تدخلش، ما تخليش فرصة انه اذا كان نظام قمعي داخل البلاد يحب يسكر على جمعية معينة ما تدخلش فيها المعادلة هذه، وانت في قدرتك وتعرف البنوك اللي هي قادرة على هذا. واذا كان فما لعبة ما اكبر ما تكونش انت الوسيلة. لكن يعني انا نقول في الكلام هذا لكن فيه برشا نعرف انه برشا ساذجة، خاطر البنك في الاخر ما يهموش، يعني صعيب باش تلقى بنك يهمه في مصلحة الناس. أغلبية البنوك مشكلتها كان الربح حتى على حساب الناس. وأقرب مثال الأزمة، ما يسمى بالأزمة المالية اللي صارت في 2008 يعني.
In our research, when we asked the women where are the restrictions coming from, what do you feel is impacting you most in your work? Basically, the majority said, about 60%, that it's coming from donors. Donors putting counterterrorism, financing regulations in their donor contracts. But also donors basically engaging in what we could say is also a form of de-risking. So making the grant criteria so complex that for many women it involves so much bureaucracy, they can't even access the funds.
These rules, by their very nature, cut off funding to small grassroots organisations who in many cases are on the front lines of addressing all forms of violence in their community. Another area of policy incoherence is that very much these counterterrorism financing rules have created a preference for larger, well-known organisations that are deemed to be trusted, that are deemed to be relatively risk-free. And that really runs very much counter to a localisation agenda that has been promoted at all levels of the international community, which again recognises that we need to have local, grassroots efforts be sustainable to ensure any meaningful change in our communities.
We see it everywhere. They encourage women to participate, but they did not support her. And they encourage women to participate, but they keep it close on a few organizations who lead the women movement, and not all the time they fit that job. So as a small NGO, I don't have the capacity to be in competition with them. So I prefer to maybe stay away or try to find a small fund. Which you are talking about a small fund and small fund and small fund. By the end, I will not become big. I will not become stronger to be in the competition with them. I will stay on the same stage.
كثير من المؤسسات تواجه معاناة خاصة بكثرة الزيارات، بكثرة الاطلاع على القرارات، بكثرة متابعة أمورها. في بعض المؤسسات تجد صعوبة بهذا الشيء. إن كان التمويل خارجي فهم يطلبوا شهادة تسجيل الجمعية، يطلبوا كشف بأعضاء الجمعية، يطلبوا النظام الأساسي للجمعية على أساس يعرفوا وين يعني هل المبلغ هذا من ضمن أهدافه أو لا، أو يطلبوا أعضاء الهيئة الإدارية المختصين بالتوقيع على الأمور المالية. هو يؤثر على المنظمة بشكل عام. أول شيء يؤخر حركتها، ثاني شيء يقلل من الدافعية عند العاملين، والشريحة المستهدفة دائما تكون من شرائح المجتمع التي بحاجة لهذا التدريب أو لهذا التغيير في أنماط سلوكية أحيانا نسعى لتغييرها من خلال بعض البرامج التوعوية، بعض البرامج التثقيفية، بعض البرامج التدريبية. لكن تدخل المانحين أو تعطيل المانحين يؤثر كثيرا على المنظمة، يؤخر أنشطتها، يعمل لها إرباك في عملية الصرف وعملية العمليات اليومية التي تجري من خلال المنظمات. أول شيء أحتاجه بثقة المجتمع الدولي بي كامرأة كناشطة، ثقة المانحين حتى أستطيع أنشط بمجتمعي.
For organizations that are the most vulnerable are those at the community level, which to me means mostly women's organizations that are bringing local leadership and local solutions to the problems in their communities. And they have very little in the way of resources, but they have deep, deep knowledge of their communities and what is needed, and they have all those deep ties. But if they can't get the basic resources to make their organizations function, then that expertise is lost. And you may have some NGO come in from the outside that doesn't have any of that experience and has a cookie cutter format program that doesn't work, and resources are just wasted.
بنسمى الأجندة الجهات المانحة تأثر حتى على التمشي والتطور الطبيعي لبعض الجمعيات، وتخلي نوع من الجمعيات في بلاصة انها في مكان انها تكون عندها مشروع وعندها استراتيجية تنبع معناها من الواقع متاع المجتمع واحتياجاته. اصبحت بعض الجمعيات من اجل انها تاخذ المنحة هذيك او الدعم هذاك تختلق يعني مشاريع تتماشى اكثر مع اللي يحبوا المانح، اكثر مع متطلبات البلاد. فهذه اشكالية ومست حتى مصداقية بعض الجمعيات عند الناس. هذه مشكلة. يعني المانحين احنا ديما نحاولوا نحكيوا مع الجهات المانحة انهم يكونوا اكثر يتماشوا مع واقع ومتطلبات البلاد، وانه في البلاد فما مجتمع مدني اللي عنده فكرة على شنو يحتاج المجتمع نتاعو، وانه ماهيش يعني مش ممكن انه نخترعوا هكا موضوع او ثيمة اللي تتوجه لها الجمعيات كل هكا كموضوع يعني على الموضة كما نقولوا. لا، بالنسبة لي أنا ما تجيش هكايا الحكاية، يعني إنه فما خطر على التوجه وعلى طريقة عمل المجتمع المدني إذا يكون مربوط فقط بفكر يعني كأنه فكر متاع الشركة لازمها فقط توصل للنتائج. يعني أعطيني النتائج وما يهمنيش شنو هو المسار وشنو الأثر اللي باش تخليه مع الناس اللي أنت استهدفتهم.
When I say that the framework has been changed, previously they used to support organization for at least 2 to 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years. Now, when you go to a donor, for example, to USAID, and they ask you to come with an idea which can be implemented in 3 months, or 6 months, or 7 months. It's not just USAID, all the donors. Sometimes they have bulk of resources. You have to come with an idea which is quick and intensive and can be implemented in a shorter span of time. So it's becoming like now a practice. You have to tune yourself as an organization to be quick fixer and to be able to deliver things in a shorter time.
They need to have impact after, for instance, 6 months of intervention, an impact that we won't see maybe before 5 years of an intervention. If we are to change a life of woman survivor, we cannot just ask her to feel okay because she was raped or she was violated against. So there is this demand in terms of the high target that we need to reach,
the high quality that we need to achieve, the impact that needs to be done, and instantly this situation we cannot really continue on operating, and otherwise the whole movement of women's rights will be compromised.
So I think there's a couple of things that need to be done quite urgently. The first is just a sort of full review of this entire framework and looking at the impact that it's having, the legitimacy of the framework and the effectiveness, because in all of these areas, you've got something that was developed in a very technocratic, undemocratic way that has just sort of taken on a life of its own and is having all of these unintended consequences. The problem with this is that, once these things sort of dissipate through the intergovernmental architecture, there's nobody left to take responsibility for the problem. But, if we really want to sort of ask ourselves the fundamental questions about how we've got to where we are, then we need, international political leadership from the G20 or the very top of the food chain. There's no remedies for this, right? So, if you're a customer of a bank, you're a consumer, and your bank, charges you unfair overdraft charges or, rips you off on your loan, you can go to your financial services authority or your financial services ombudsman. If you're a non-profit organisation that receives a letter from the bank saying, we don't want your business anymore, go elsewhere because we think you're a terrorism risk, you have no redress at all. You've got nowhere to go. People have tried to take cases to the Financial Services Ombudsman, the Financial Conduct Authority. They've just said, it's a commercial decision, we're not interested. So fundamentally, because these organisations are the most vulnerable and the ones that are just being cut adrift and lack sort of support from the structures and organisations that we would hope would help them, we've got to find a way of getting redress to organisations that are, actually quite devastated by this stuff.
As a human being, I think that it's just wrong to accept that kind of collateral damage where innocent people die. As a policy analyst, I think it's terribly ineffective in terms of countering terrorism. We have seen since the anti-terrorist financing regime went into effect after the Patriot Act, more terrorist organizations. Osama bin Laden is killed and ISIS emerges, and that dynamic keeps happening over and over again. And it's not because terrorists are getting money, it's because there are conditions in the world that are fueling terrorism. Instability, failed states, lack of education and opportunity, repression, all those things are helping to fuel this. And so if you make it more difficult for civil society to operate in these areas where they might provide some alternatives for people, you're just adding fuel to the fire and actually, in my mind, making terrorism more likely to happen.
كان جات مكافحة الإرهاب بالطريقة هذيك نجحت، راهو نعيشوا في نوع من السلام، لكن أنا ما نمنش بها، ما نمنش بالمفهوم هذا مكافحة الإرهاب إنه فقط للقضاء على الأشرار، فكرة الأشرار bad people evil. وفي نفس الوقت شفنا أنه بس تحت اسم مسمى مكافحة الإرهاب المناضلين الحقوقيين توضعوا في السجون، المدافعين على حقوق الإنسان في العالم، مش حتى في البلدان متاعنا، يعني في المنطقة، يعني في الكوب 21 كوب 21 في باريس اللي صارت وقع تحت معناها قانون الطوارئ وتحت قانون مكافحة الإرهاب إيقافات جمة في ناشطين في الدفاع عن البيئة، يعني ايكولوجيست. في تركيا تويكا باسم مكافحة الإرهاب منظمات كيما منظمة العفو الدولية يعني أمنستي انترناشونال قاعدين يتحطوا في السجون باسم أنهم إرهابيين.
The government tries to say that security comes first. You know, whenever people say this, you should feel that they would like to control by using this expression itself. It is the expression of for me, the dictators. You know, stop any other thing, because security is that. In the last 5 years, we started, you know, advocating for human rights will serve security. It is not because security, we need security to stop defenders of human rights, because this is the way to be victorious over terrorists, extremists, and fundamentalists. You can't fight them by security or any military action alone. It is the people that should support the government. And if you'd like the people to support the government, you should give them human rights and support them and enlighten them.
على الحكومة أن تجد وسائل أخرى، أن تجد إجراءات تحمي البلاد أكيد من الإرهاب، لكن من غير ما تضيق على المجتمع المدني، لا من ناحية التمويل ولا أيضا من ناحية تنفيذ المشاريع أو من ناحية المطالبة والتواصل والنقاش والمشاركة في القرارات أو المقترحات أو البرامج أو السياسات، يعني في كل هذا. وهذا دور المجتمع المدني، وهذا في المجتمعات الصحية في الدول الديمقراطية يكون هذا دورهم الفعلي. وعلى الحكومات أن لا تبني الجدران بينها وبين منظمات المجتمع المدني.
The concern is that it just cannot be that regulations that were made up in a very short period of time, as we heard, it's only 6 weeks that they were made up, and that were made up to, you know, make sure terrorists cannot continue to operate, are actually hitting the ones who are working often at, you know, the risk of their own lives in our societies, addressing the root causes, and as well as working for the human rights of all, which is key if we want to actually address any form of violence, including violent extremism and terrorism in the world. We cannot afford to lose those brave activists.